How did you follow along with the conversation?
I think you gotta have to jog a little
your
bit
memory
here.
a little bit.
Start with like the example of
Yeah, well, we got to the end, and you said like only some of it had, or like you kind of zoned in and out of being able to follow what was going on. I was trying to make sure that as much of it was as possible was staying in a pretty low level, not too abstract thing, but I mean we're talking about some pretty abstract stuff. So you said you wanted to start with what example?
well, I was trying to remember the main example we were talking about.
Well, I mean, we kind of go through a couple things. The start was just kind of talking about the threeness of everything, right? We related it to the Trinity. JP's way of kind of sorting out was that there's like a ground of being, and it's like the principles, or almost like the core principles of existence that are totally unmanifest. They're the ground of being. And then there's constraints on how those principles can manifest, which are like the laws of physics, the laws of reality, whatever. And then there's when those things meet in a way that works, then that's like the third category. And so we mapped that onto a whole bunch of different things. John Vervaeke has one way of talking about that. He has like the ground of being and the ground of intelligibility, and then I forget what he calls his third category. But maybe it's like flow or like a meaning or something like that. But the ground of being is like almost like the energy at the bottom of existence, and the ground of intelligibility is, I mean, you think about the word intelligible, right?
Yeah, was it that God was supposed to be the energy, or the bedrock of whatever potential and all that, or the origin of potential or whatever?
Well, I mean, he marries it to the whole Trinity. So he says God is all three of those categories. And so he puts the Father as being like the ground of being, this potentiality. And then the Son, the Logos, because it says like Christ is the Word. So the Word is like something that's intelligible, something that you can actually hear, something that you can see, something that you could understand, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's the perfect manifestation.
Is intelligible similar to tangible or something?
I mean, I would say they're similar. They're not. I don't think it's the same root word or anything, but it's the same kind of idea. It's just it's. I mean, if I just stop making any sense, what I'm saying isn't intelligible anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. But if I'm saying a clear word, then it's. I mean, like you said, it's tangible, but it's intelligible. It's something that you can understand. You can follow what I'm saying, right?
Okay.
And so he's saying the meeting of the Father and the Son is this bliss of the Spirit. Like that's the place, whether it's a place or a moment or a whatever. That's the thing. That's their relationship is the meeting. It's like when. So I mean, I went from there. I started talking about video games, talking about how, there are constraints on your abilities, and there's a potential for like victory.
Mm-hmm. And when I remember hearing that.
Right,
and when
yeah.
they intersect is enjoyable.
Right, it's enjoyable. That's like flow.
Yeah.
Right. So that's like the premise of what we were talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where did you get lost?
Well, I just want to make sure I was mapping on. So like there was a negative of death we talked about, and
Right.
Death represented that potential, or like God or whatever, or like
Yeah. Which it would be weird to kind of marry potential and
well,
or
and you
death
got
and
your
potential and
Satan
God.
maybe.
Right. Well, I was learning recently that apparently even the Satan and all the demons in a lot of Orthodox thought, they even talk about the demons as being like the left hand of God, which is weird too. But then you get that same kind of three-part structure where you have the right hand and the left hand of God, and then the full unity of God, right? Where they like meet in the brain or whatever. Obviously, God doesn't have a brain, but
that's pretty weird.
saying that like evil is like part of God.
Yeah, I mean,
well, I think maybe
wouldn't
that's
it-
phrasing
wouldn't
wrong.
it
It's
be
probably not
like-
that evil is part of God.
huh?
It's probably not that actually that evil is part of God, but like that the destructive force.
Well, what about like the potential that God created was still evil? Like evil came out of, or like when God created, there was potential, and then if it was evil, then it still came from God indirectly.
Well, okay, then you get into a whole tangent about what evil is, and we're going to even go into that a little bit. And that was what he goes into later in his article. He talks about evil and what evil could be.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the way I try to understand this is that evil is almost something that can only be experienced subjectively.
Okay, yeah.
And so, I should kind of explain by that, because I think that might sound kind of crazy up front, but.
Well, I mean, when you say that, I immediately think that the things that you feel convicted as evil, or the things that are evil to you, are subjective. But then we still have objective things that we consider wrong for humanity.
Right, but then
So
that's from the subjective
objective,
experience
though.
of being a human.
Okay.
Right? So there's still a subject included in that equation. So the point is that if you get out past all of the beings that there are things for them that they shouldn't do, you get to God, and God is the being that sort of encompasses all of reality, and there's nothing that is sort of outside, like out of all the tools, all the things that you could do, he knows how to do all of them in their right place. You know, Ecclesiastes says there's a time and a place for everything. And I think maybe what part of what that author was trying to get at when he said that is that literally everything, well, okay, when you are making like cookies or something like that, and you get the recipe wrong, you get something that you didn't want, right? You get like gross cookies. You like swap sugar out with salt accidentally. But they both look white, so you make a little mistake there. That's a pretty common mistake. When you get those cookies, they aren't good anymore, right? They're bad cookies, right? But that doesn't mean that any of the things that made up those cookies are bad. It means that the way that you combine those ingredients, they weren't arranged correctly, and then you get something bad, right? So in the totality of all the things that exist, if you know how to put them all together correctly, then you can make good cookies out of all existence.
Well, I mean, that still applies to like the ingredient, or like the ingredient of existence is death, and if you put it in the wrong place, then it's...
Yeah, that's actually probably a good way of saying it, yeah. Because it's not like, I mean, even just being alive is just deaths on various levels in order to keep you alive, right? And a culture surviving depends on people dying at the right time. Because if people stay alive forever, especially particular ways of being a person, like you talk about Dracula, right? What that whole story is about is a guy who won't die, right? But, okay, what am I saying? That if people don't die, then culture can't survive. Partially, it's like, okay, if you get people who are super attached to a certain way of living, you have too much conservatism, then you prevent the society from being able to move forward.
Yeah.
Right? And so even if the physical person doesn't need to die, at least the ideology that exists in the person eventually needs to die. So in order for even the experience of life to happen and for an entity to exist, there has to be deaths all the way up and down the spectrum of, right? So death is, like that's a good point of saying that death is an important ingredient. It just needs to be put in the right place.
Yeah.
He tries to deal with, in his article, talking about like the worst tragedies of human existence and stuff, though, like, because obviously you can kind of just say that simple, like, oh, well, you just got to put death in the right place. But then when you start thinking about these horrible tragedies like the Holocaust and whatnot, or like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all those people that died all at once, it's like those are insane amounts of death, and how can those be reconciled?
Well, you don't have to like justify and say it was right.
Right. You can
Like,
say
you could
that
just
actually
say,
was the wrong place.
Yeah, I think. I mean, that's where I would. That's where we have all decided intuitively to say that those things weren't the right ingredients, or the wrong amount.
Well, there's another. They weren't the right ingredients. They weren't in the
wrong
right place.
amount of them. Yeah.
That death should have. I mean, even then, you can just like people say that it's like, oh, he died too young. It's like we understand that death is all right and that there's a place for death, but like, okay, it shouldn't have happened there. That is the wrong place, even for that person's death. It's like that. Even that person should have died. Even those cells that made up that person should have died at a certain place in time, but it shouldn't have been there. And in that way, that was a bad arrangement for existence to be in.
So, good and bad death basically is one of the points that you were talking about, and it was applicable in Lion King.
Yeah, so the Lion King is something. It's all connected there, but it's a slightly different perspective on it. Or we start talking about the Lion King, talking about how, well, okay, no, maybe it's not that different. it's talked about how death is, even why death would be like associated with a feminine principle, and maybe it's not worth assigning genders to it. But well, the reason I was talking about the gender of it is because I was talking about Mother's Day and stuff too. If you remember this part, this I assume this part landed for you, right? As far as talking about when you're having a really frustrating day, especially as a really little kid, and everything's just falling apart.
Yeah. Okay.
And your mom gives you a hug. It's suddenly like everything, you're able to just kind of reset. You kill the version of the day that you had in your mind.
Mm-hmm,
You let the version of yourself that you're trying to be die, and suddenly you return to this state of death, but the state of potential.
Yeah. So
Right.
that was what you were making the point of Pumba, or what's the lion's name? Because I know I'm gonna make I can make jokes, but it's not a joke.
Okay, I wondered if the last time we had this conversation about Lion King characters, if you actually knew who they were or not. Pumbaa is the wild boar. Timon
Yeah. So
is
when
the meerkat.
Pumba goes off, he leaves his dad.
Simba. Okay,
When-
I can see why you get those confused. Simba is the lion.
Yeah. So him going to this paradise kind of thing. That's him embracing the death of like responsibility, or he's dying to the responsible part of his life. That's the negative for him to go into that.
He encounters two different versions of this death thing. He encounters the negative version of it first. He encounters Scar and sees Scar kill his father, and like, because the whole way I what I was trying to bring out of that story is that Simba had a certain way that he thought he needed to be king. He thought he knew what being a king meant, and that had to die.
Okay, but what I said still works though, I think, right?
We'll say it again.
When he, like, you're talking about the positive of resetting your day with this death and like retreating back into what's comfortable, that's your mother.
Mm-hmm.
But he's retreating away from his responsibility by going into the like paradise area with
Timon and Pumbaa.
yeah. That works on that level too.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to draw attention to there.
Okay.
with telling about is that so yeah, he goes to this place, and Timon and Pumbaa sort of act as like this, like a maternal figure anyways.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the reason I feel like there's even a really strong connection there is that he doesn't just go out into the wilderness. He finds like a paradise area in the wilderness. He returns to nature, which is like closely associated with Mother Nature, right?
Well, I mean, even in that case, as a lion, that would be like the most comfortable area probably to him.
Right. Well, even though, I mean, like initially he's in kind of like a jungle, or he's in a safari. Is that? No, safari isn't. A savanna. That's the word I'm looking
Yeah.
for. He's in a savanna originally. But then, then he goes into this like total just paradise of just. But then he totally forgets what it means to be a lion. He doesn't even care at all. He starts. He's a lion eating bugs, right? That was something that JP
Oh yeah, I
drew
remember
attention
that.
to,
Okay.
right? So he just totally gives up on trying to even be a lion, much less a king. And then it's from that place that all this doubt. So I mean, the reason he goes there is because he encounters this shadow of doubt. He is literally in the valley of the shadow of death when his father dies. He goes into this valley, and when his father dies, due to him, basically he's in the valley and he's practicing out his roar. He shouldn't have been there. This is, but again, he's too focused on what he thinks it means to be king. So he's gone out and he's just trying to practice his version of being king, and that's ultimately what leads to the demise of his father. Like that's what's the name of the dad? Mufasa. That Mufasa dies there, and it is because of Simba's mistaken understanding of what it means to be king. And so then he begins to doubt his understanding of what life was about. So he thought his life had this certain trajectory of like he's going to go up and he's going to be like his dad. He's going to do these badass roars, and he's going to like just tell everybody what to do. And like he has this very childish notion of what it means to be king. And then that comes into question suddenly. And it's not like it was like that as opposed to something else. That was his entire idea of what existence looked like. His whole view of what life is came into question at that moment.
So what would be your three symbols to map on? In
Yeah,
Lion
okay,
King then?
that's good. There's an actuality of the way.
A king is the reality.
So
of
there's an
kingship.
abstract principle of kingship,
Okay.
and even Mufasa isn't that exactly. He's a higher representation of it, but there's an even a higher representation beyond that. It's supposed to be sort of a fractal story that you see this principle going all the way up. That even beyond Mufasa, there's a deeper principle of what it means to be kingly.
Mm-hmm.
But at least from the perspective of Simba, Mufasa is a representation of that higher principle. And so he has an understanding of that, and then he has to. Well, let's see. So Mufasa is like a manifested version of it. He's constrained by by being a lion. He can't just be the absolute principle of being a king. He's a king, and what being kingly looks like in the context of being a lion. So those are the constraints there.
Mm-hmm. So he'd be the middle, sort of. Right.
So Mufasa would sort of be. It's hard to say that a person is the because there's the principle and there's the constraints and there's the experience of those things meeting. So you could maybe say that
like he is for that community, but he's not exclusively.
Well, okay, it's Mufasa's lionness that is his constraints, and then there's the principle of being a king, and the principle of kingship and the constraint of lionness meet in Mufasa, and Mufasa has the spirit of the king. That's
so, what about like at the essence
category.
of being lioness, like because if you were saying that, is it Simba? Simba goes fully into this death. Even past being a lion into like not identifying with that at all.
Right.
Is that still in those three though? Like,
yeah. Well, now he's transcended his little versions of those three, and he's got into a deeper. Yeah, I know this. You're right. This it does get hard to follow when you try to map it perfectly. But again, because these are all representational, we can talk about the great versions of these things. So there's the great father and there's the great mother.
I don't know if you want to throw in a mother right now with what we're doing. Oh, well, I guess the mother saying is the death.
Yeah. So there's, and I think I'm struggling with this because I haven't totally sorted this out yet. It's difficult to understand, and because these symbols kind of tend to flip depending on what tradition you're looking at them through. But the way JP was laying it out, anyways, is that there's a ground of being that has to do with like that's the masculine principle of. Oh geez, no, it flipped back and forth. Anyway, he wants to say there's nothingness and then there's dharma. That's the Buddhist way of saying it. There's nothingness, which is the ground of, or that's like unrestrained potential. That's the principles, and then there's dharma, which is like logos, which is like the constraints. It's like the rules for the way reality can actually manifest. So again, that's the lion, like the lion as an organism.
Is almost like a way of like showing the two categories, and then within them it splits off again.
Yeah,
because
it's
within
like
the lionness, I could imagine there's also another separate death within it, of like what Simba did. Is he went into the lionness, and then in that one he split apart even further into
right. Well, okay, so this is maybe I can follow this thread though down to the bottom of what we're talking about here with this, and then ultimately get back to Easter, because that was what his article was about. And I don't know if you made it that far or you started to doze off at that point.
We'll have to keep going.
Okay, so Simba, he pushes his understanding of what it means to be a lion to the very limits of what it can do, and it fails him. And so he enters into a nothingness. He enters into, exactly, that's the edge of the world. So he goes back to so he had an idea of what being looked like, and he has to kind of push past it into the bottom of being and just kind of see what can... It almost is easier to explain in the Jesus story for me, because that's what I've been kind of thinking about more recently. But the truest version of what it meant to be king rose to the top after he dissolved his understanding of what it meant to be king. So it's like the process of melting down gold too, or melting down something to see what its worth is, right? It's like you burn up the things that aren't gold, but the gold doesn't burn up. Right? He lays down his understanding of what it means to be king. He enters into this nothingness.
Yeah. Even when he was eating bugs, he wasn't still not a lion.
Right. Yeah, sure.
He burned it, like he defiled himself or whatever you want to call it, but like after this process he was able to be
Right.
built
So
back
he even
up
so
into
that
the,
that even it breaks on our understanding of what it means to be a lion, and that's the point, is that it's breaking all of your understanding about what it means to be, and then letting this wider, deeper understanding of what it means to exist, and especially what it means to be a king and to be a lion. That's to be the Lion King.
that's kind of a fun way of
So it's like you would
the
think that a
Lion
lion
King is technically the middle of king and lion.
Right, exactly. It's the lion and the king. It's the relationship between those two things.
Yeah.
Which so that it's good that we have a title that could line up with this threeness.
Yeah,
scheme,
yeah.
Right. I'm trying to make sure that I followed that down correctly though. So like, I guess I'm just trying to square this Buddhist language, because they call that ground of being the nothingness, and I still get confused almost every time
Maybe there's also like ways to find synonyms for words that particularly trip you up.
I think the reason they want to call it nothingness, though, is that it hasn't been constrained into a thing yet. It's not that it's...
yeah,
right?
Because nothingness, as we understand it, isn't really a thing. Like you
Well,
can't call something nothingness. It's just things we don't know yet.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even in the Genesis cosmology,
Yeah.
there is the divine father, or there's the principles, and there's the nothingness, which, again, this is where we got kind of confused, because talking about the Trinity, it seems like all those persons kind of get flipped around, and they all occupy those all. Each of them can be in any of one of those three categories, depending on the context you're looking at them from, it seems like. So sometimes you can look at God being the principles, and the Spirit being the nothingness, and the Son being the thing that happens in the middle. That's the way I thought about it. JP looks at it as the Son being the principles, the Father being the nothingness, and the Spirit being them meeting. So I don't know. I think maybe it actually works from all different perspectives. Maybe you could even say that the Father is the Son and the Spirit meeting each other too. And that's really circular and all over the place. But I think maybe that somehow works, because there's a lot of theology that talks about like all three of them being distinct, but somehow like eternally in relationship with each other. The Trinity is such a strange...
Well, that's the thing, is like I don't know how much effort and attempt to rationalize that. Like I've heard so much about all this, and I'm like, isn't the whole idea that it's just too complicated? It's like it and even like the symbolism, like you're like, oh well, maybe I can't say this because this doesn't work within this version of what God is. It's like kind of tricky to get the...
Well, the point is that we're kind of at the premise of the conversation not saying, like, because I'm talking about it symbolically, and then because he's talking about it symbolically, and because that's what religion does, we're not trying to close the system up and say that everything has to be consistent and has to make sense all of the time.
Right, you're not like talking on like a verse by verse or like a very hyper specific...
Yeah, it's not rationalism, it's not modernism. It's not saying that all this stuff is going to be perfectly consistent. It's saying that if you can latch onto this story and begin to juxtapose all these different experiences of this approximate narrative, you're going to begin to have a sense of what the truth is. Not that you're going to have a necessarily super technical understanding. You can have technical conversations about it to try to tease it out a little bit as well. But ultimately, it's coming to experience this truth is something that you have to experience and like have within you, not something that you can just look at it and just read it and understand it.
Yeah.
Which is something else we kind of went into a little bit, not yesterday, but whenever it was, a couple of days ago. Okay, but getting to Easter. Basically, the way I think about it, and the way I think about all this relating to it, is the same thing about how, like, so his understanding of what it means to be a lion dies, and then the true, like, whatever is true about being a lion, that's what remains after he's kind of let it all die. If you have somebody who, let's say, is the perfect Lion King, and he dies, he lays himself down, he decides to die, he enters into that same process of going into nothingness and then coming back. If he's already actually perfect, he's actually perfectly living out what it means to be the Lion King, then when he comes back, he returns out of the nothingness. maybe he looks a little bit different. Maybe there's some marginal things that seem a little bit different about him, but he's actually the same essential thing because there was nothing that was wrong. There was nothing that wasn't true about his existence, right? And so when Christ dies, Christ, whether historically or mythologically, represents this perfect meeting of the principles and the constraints. Perfect meeting of the ground of being and the ground of intelligibility, right? Do those terms still make sense?
I'm just thinking about what's the benefit of dying then? Like, why would you melt down the gold if it's already
well,
perfect?
because I think this is finally kind of rescuing a lot of the passages that I really didn't understand in like the epistles in the New Testament and stuff, where Paul talks about like, if Christ doesn't die, then what does any of this mean? The reason to me that it's important that Christ dies and then resurrects is because that's literally what proves it proves the trueness of his whole message. He said, if he says literally, I am the way, the truth, and the life, then that means that when you kill Christ, if he's really, really the way, the truth, and the life, then as soon as he enters back into existence, or as soon as anything comes back, Christ comes back inevitably. It's like you can't kill it because it's actually the way things deeply are.
Yeah.
Like, so it's just, when you kill a person, then all the matter that made up them comes back to life in some way, right? Like you bury their body and it decomposes, it becomes a plant, and it becomes other people, right?
Yeah.
And the principles that made up that person don't come back exactly the same way. But if you have a person it's like, if a person manifesting where the whole universe is headed, then even if you kill them, they come back.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of why Christ resurrects in the story, in the Passion narrative. He resurrects after 3 days. He goes to hell and comes back. He goes all the way to the bottom of existence and comes back. But ultimately, we believe Christ is coming back again in the end.
But he didn't die a second time.
Yeah, but it's like that we're going to meet Christ too. So
I don't
maybe
know.
I'm kind of extrapolating there a little bit, but it's like it seems that Christ is always on his way. If Christ, again, if that's a meaningful way of understanding what Christ is, that he's like a perfect meeting of what the principles of existence and the constraints on reality. Like, if he is literally the way of life, then that's where the universe is headed. Like, that's where evolution is headed. That's where the distillation of reality is headed. It's distilling down to being like
So
Christ.
people are going to get better.
Pardon?
So every day is a better day because things are moving in the right direction. That's what we all say. That's the general sentiment about the world, I think, is things are getting better every day. I was thinking about when you're talking about that, how like people die and then are reformed into other people. I was like, how much do you think we actually are indirectly cannibals?
How much are we 100%, basically. There's probably very little. Maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I would think that there would be very little of the food that we're eating that hasn't been a person a lot of times before.
Yeah, I think that's a really fun, completely irrelated way to.
I don't think it's totally irrelated.
Well, no, it is. It is what you're talking about. It's like that's clearly not Jesus right there. What I'm eating,
right? But it's like you're giving it a second chance to come back around. And
so, what about what Jesus? What about what Jesus ate?
Well, okay, but this does get into like the Eucharist, like.
Oh, okay, very nice tie-in.
Right, because we actually do, and the Catholic idea about this is that it literally is the body and blood of Christ. And so when we take communion, again, I think the symbolism of the bread and the wine it ties into that threeness too, where it's like the wine, and I think this works pretty well because it even comes down to how wine affects you. Wine breaks down your way of being, gets you drunk, right? And so your inhibitions disappear, your constraints on who you are,
Mm-hmm.
right? So wine is this thing that even the experience of drinking it symbolically represents like the chaotic nothingness of being.
Mm-hmm.
And bread is this formed structure that is like, has to do with bodiness. I mean, Christ says, this is my body, the bread and the body. So the body is the form of that energy, of that
Mm-hmm.
life, right? And so when we're having communion, we're allowing these things to represent their cosmic extremes, I think.
And when you put them together, you get soggy bread.
Exactly, which is the core of existence. Soggy bread. I think so.
That's why you always gotta keep your symbolism abstract.
Because if you push it too far, you definitely get to a limit with soggy bread. But it's like if the blood or if the wine represents the deep like ground of being, principles of being, and the bread represents those constraints and like the most extreme holy good version of them, then it's like we're trying to let those things meet in us. So we're ideally, that's it says, like we're entering into Christ through that. If Christ is the meeting of those two things, then by having communion, we're trying to enter into Christ. We're trying to do the same thing that Christ did. And we're asking, we're putting ourselves in a position to like think about that and will it into being and sort of ask God to make that be the case. I don't know. There's probably a lot of different ways you could think about what's happening there, but I think that might be a helpful. I think that ties it in a little bit too.
I think that's a little tricky, but I like the general idea about it.
Cool. Okay. Hopefully it's a little clearer now.
Yeah, I mean, I think communion's another separate kind of
yeah, probably
or pretty complicated.
Semi-complicated, pretty complicated, yeah. Cool.
You won't get it fully understood in like 5 seconds, 5 minutes.